Action.
Right, I'm Cameron Shackley, and I'm from Group 6, and I'm looking into, basically I started looking into reclaimed timber, and my initial kind of thoughts were looking at pallets, and so then I started looking further, and I came across, basically on the high street there's the roads building, which is at the moment covered in scaffolding, and so what they've done is they're taking off the roof to put in a new floor, and it's that timber that I've managed to acquire, which is this beam here, which as you can see is quite nice and heavy, and basically in construction it's 102 years old, but obviously the tree is older than that, which you could probably determine if you had a full log. And so I'm looking to reclaim timber and looking into different ways of testing it, which is all this stuff here, which I'll get into later. And kind of a key thing that I looked into was surface, and how you might treat the surface and the way that wood reacts to fluid and water. So this piece here, I kind of figured out is probably from one of the rafters up here. You can kind of see all the nails that are stuck in it, and this here, and then this is probably the mortise for the tenon and mortise for the purlin to sit into. And so it's quite interesting looking at how this was used before, and these are plaster marks from when the plaster was stuck on there. Then this is kind of the catalogue of the samples that I got. You can see there's all these different kind of joints that were left on the wood from obviously when it's been deconstructed. These ones here, this one I completely planed on all sides, which revealed this really lovely, this is the heartwood here, and then this is heartwood here, and then this is the sapwood there. And I took this piece and cut it up into equal sized samples, which is what all of these samples are from, so they're all from the same piece. And the kind of notable observations I made from just looking at the wood initially is that it's got a really tight grain, which shows that it's slow grown, and the age of the wood means that it could be like pre-forestry, so it was just naturally grown, and because of this it'll be a really strong wood, and because of the relatively constant grain it might have been grown on a north-facing slope, and due to it being an older timber it's more settled, and so you wouldn't have to sort of design in movement as much. And then I read up on trees, and I basically discovered that it's Scots pine, or at least I'm fairly confident that it's Scots pine. The timber itself in the past it was used for ships, so that kind of indicates that it's good when used with water, and it was used in pit mining before, and then kind of modern day uses nowadays is it's used for roof timbers, stairs, doorways and skirtings, and it's still kind of used in some pit props in some mines. And then the kind of two key precedent things that I was looking at to kind of think about things is this bird hide by Neil Southern Architects up in Scotland, which is made completely from Scots pine, and the whole kind of point about it was that it was kind of an exemplary use of Scots pine, and so that's really interesting. And then this one here is this Japanese timber charring technique called shosugiban, which apparently treats the wood for 80 years against rot and insects. So that's really quite interesting. It's kind of quite a natural way of treating the wood. And an interesting thing about this house here is one of his kind of inspirations for it was like a cave, which is kind of interesting in that our Autea tupa might actually have quite a cave-like appearance. And so then my direction of testing is mainly looking at surface, but then also looking at joints and how you might actually make joints, and kind of learning that myself through the making, looking at the way how grain is important when making a joint and how you might chisel it and how that affects it, and then also looking at water and fluid and how that reacts with the wood. So kind of one of the first tests I did, well, I think I'll just skip ahead quickly to the joints. So this joint I made it's called Ari Kare, which is a Japanese dovetail. And so this piece here is supported by this major piece here through a dovetail. Obviously I'm not a master carpenter, so there's a bit of give in it, but the idea is there, you know. And it's interesting to note that if you went in with the chisel in a certain way, it would completely split the wood, and so you had to be really careful. then this next piece here is more of a kind of a compressive, whereas that's more tensile strength. This is more compressive in that it has these interlocking pieces like this, and then they kind of interlock together like that, and so that could potentially be quite useful for creating columns in the building. And so then one of the other tests to do kind of with this idea of strength testing and looking at joints and things was I took a new piece of pine and an old piece and one of the Scots pine pieces that I have, made sure that they were the same length and the same shape and size, and then got a big machine to apply a load to it, and marked off at how much load it could take and how much deflection it actually had. And it was really interesting. This was more of kind of a shear, like a tearing break, which would indicate that it's more flexible, but because it's probably got a bit more moisture in it in some way, whereas this kind of had a big snap and crack, and so it's more of a brittle failure. So now we'll move on to these. And so then these are all the tests that I've done. With the first kind of test that I did was looking at steaming and to see how steaming kind of affects the wood. And so the most interesting thing really was I basically steamed them all for 30 seconds, all three of these ones here. And the most interesting thing was actually resin kind of exuded from the knots, whereas this piece didn't really have it didn't have a knot in it. And only after like 25 minutes did a little bit of resin come out. And then this was looking at sanding, looking how that affects the wood. This was a machine sanded. This was drilling, and again the grain comes into effect and you have to go slower to make sure that it doesn't completely rip the grain up. This is chiseling and seeing kind of what marks that leaves. Then I soaked these two pieces for 12 hours in water, vinegar, 24, and then 36. And sort of with increasing time they became a bit more flexible until after the 36 hours one I was able to actually snap the water one against a wall, but the vinegar one I was able to just snap in my hands, so they kind of, you know, the acidity of the vinegar has probably weakened it more than the water would have. These two pieces here, I froze this piece and that piece it was just normal, to try and see how difficult it might be to actually work a much colder piece of wood. It was relatively the same. There was kind of not much difference. And I kind of forgot to mention at the beginning, this is the context at which the wood sits in. So you've got various pieces of wood here. And the oak is kind of quite important because oak is generally quite resistant to weathering. And so now the main focus of what I was looking at was this shosugi ban, which is this Japanese timber charring. And so for these pieces, I charred these for 1, 2, and 5 minutes. This one for 14 minutes, which had a knot in it, because the reason being is I charred it, the resin caught fire and I could just leave it and it just sat there burning away. This piece was much thicker, but also it was a different cut. So these are with the grain and this is across the grain, and so you can see these start to open up and become a lot more porous. Then thinking about treating and how it might, because for our Autotupa, Izzy's looking at rammed earth, and so that's got a lot of thermal mass, but you need to protect that from the rain. And so what I was thinking is how much you treat the wood to then make it weather resistant. And so this stick here kind of describes the process. You start off with normal wood, and then you slowly char it, and then the spaces between these lines actually ignites and glows red, and then that's what creates the flame. And then once it's burned through, then it starts to really char like this, and then you brush it off, and then you get this lovely texture here. And so this is just a normal piece of pine. That's 1 coat, 2 coats, and 3 coats of linseed oil. This is just charred, and this is charred pine plus 3 coats of linseed oil, and then this is the same with oak. And then this was a plaster cast looking at the looking at how you might capture the grain. But if these sheets just describe the process I went through with all the different tests I did and noting down at different times how I went through things. But difficult to do with because this is more important. And so then this was the key test. Now, this was the most important thing, which was looking at how it might shed water. And so what I did was I did was I set them all up in a line like this with a little piece of sponge at the bottom, weighed them all beforehand, weighed the sponge beforehand, and then in increments I went 5 mils of water onto each of them, and then another 5 and then another 5 to see how they might all shed the water. The untreated one completely just absorbed it straight away, but then the linseed oil ones, they each shed it kind of proportionally to how much linseed oil they had on them. The charred piece kind of sucked it up quite a bit, but it was better than the linseed oil. And so then the really key thing was actually this piece here, which is that one there. You can see it shed the water really well, and so that's really interesting in that this might become a really useful cladding, like a way of treating the wood to be a cladding system to protect against the rain outside the building and then the rain inside the building, because our furnace burns hydrogen, which actually releases water, which can create steam inside. And so it's about looking at it maybe inside and outside. And then this is just noting the weights. And so to kind of conclude it all, it was really interesting doing these tests, but they weren't quite as useful as maybe these ones. But it's still interesting to see how wood is used, and it gives you the knowledge for then if you were to build with wood, you kind of understand it a bit better. The joints were really interesting in kind of knowing how actually you could use that kind of a joint for a tensile strength and this one for compressive. But I would say that this is kind of the key thing, and it's actually this piece here. Figuring out that all this kind of combines together to make potentially quite a weather resistant thing. Yeah, I made a short video of me charring the wood, but that can just play in the background. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.